There you go. You're up, Katie.
Great, thanks, Gary. So hopefully everybody can hear me and see my screen. So as Gary said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about kind of where we are with Atlantic Menhaden management, because I think we're in a really cool place right now, and we've accomplished some really great and interesting things that I think represent a big leap forward for forage fish management for the Commission and for the Atlantic coast in general. But there's still plenty of stuff to do with this topic. And so I do think, we've done a great job with this first step. I'm excited to have accomplished it, and I'm excited to talk to you guys about it today. And I'm also excited to talk to you guys about it, about what comes next. So some of you I can see on the screen, I have been involved in this, and some of you I know have been involved from more of the commissioner or management standpoint. So hopefully there is some new information or new thoughts here, but let's just jump right in. So I want to start out by talking about, first of all, this is a team effort. Obviously, the commission has been working on these ecosystem reference points for well over 10 years now, probably closer to 20 years when you go back to look at some of the first interest in treating menhaden as a forage fish. And so these are the people who are involved on the most recent stock assessment, where we got the ecological reference points through peer review along with the single species assessment. Shout out to Micah Dean from Massachusetts DMF specifically, but as you can see, it's a lot of people, and this isn't even everybody, but definitely a team effort for a really great project here. So today I just want to give you a little bit of background about Atlantic menhaden and their fish and the fisheries and their life history and their role in the ecosystem, as well as a little bit about ASMFC role and process. I think you guys are probably a little more familiar with it than some of the places we've talked to about this, but I think it doesn't hurt to kind of talk about ASMFC because we are a little weird in the fishery management scheme. As well as sort of how the Menhaden assessment and management has changed up to this point. And then talk about the 2020 ecological reference point assessment, as well as the recommended modeling management tool, and how that got actually implemented, what we're doing with it now, and like I said, what we want to do with it next. So a little bit of the background. So Atlantic menhaden, as I'm sure many of you know, is a small planktivorous schooling fish that is found on the Atlantic coast from Florida all the way up to Nova Scotia. They spawn in coastal waters, and then their larvae move into the bays and estuaries for the first year or two of life, and then they move out to join this coastal migratory population. They school by age and size, with older, larger fish moving further north during these seasonal migrations. They support the largest fishery by volume on the Atlantic coast. The major fishery is this reduction landings fishery, which is the green bars here, which takes those fish and puts them into fish meal and fish oil for things like aquaculture feed, pet food, omega-3 supplements for a while there were real popular. And that's the majority of the landings, peaking at about 600,000 metric tons, down to about a little under 200,000 metric tons in recent years. The bait fishery is the other component of this, and they're the blue line. But as you can see, the scale on these axes is pretty different, is about an order of magnitude difference between the scale of the menhaden fishery, the reduction fishery, and the scale of the bait landings. But the bait fishery is a smaller scale, spread out over all of the states. A lot of interest in that, and that has been growing, especially as other sources of bait have declined in recent years. So menhaden is a major fishery target, and a very important commercial fishery on the directed side. It's also an important forage fish for a lot of different species, including popular game fish like striped bass, bluefish, and weakfish, which the Commission all manages, as well as your charismatic megafauna like your osprey and your marine mammals, which the Commission doesn't manage, but obviously there's interest in those groups from other stakeholders. So ASMFC is the body that actually manages Atlantic menhaden. And we're an interstate fisheries management commission, which means we're kind of in between the state and the federal level in terms of the management that we provide. We're made up of 16 Atlantic states on the coast, all the way from Maine down to Florida. And we also include DC, the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So we basically get everybody to the table to talk about these highly migratory species that move through state waters and therefore are of interest to these state management bodies. Um, and that includes about 24 species or species complexes on the Atlantic coast. And unlike other fisheries commissions, there is a Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission, a Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission, and a Great Lakes Fisheries Commission. ASMFC actually has regulatory authority vested in us by Congress. So when we set rules, the states are obligated to follow those rules. And when I say we versus the states are us and we are the states. So it's a little bit of a blurred lines there in terms of who's doing what. But basically, we make decisions as a group for all of these states together for these shared resources, and then individual states have to abide by those regulations. We're not bound by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which gives us some flexibility in terms of the regulations that we can put forward and the goals and objectives of our management plan, for good and for ill. So Menhaden management has changed over time. The first fishery management plan was adopted in 1981. There was no quota or regulatory requirements. It was just getting some thoughts on the books there. And we actually didn't have a quota for this fishery until 2012, when the first wide quota was implemented after an overfishing finding in the 2011 assessment. So over that time period, we have recognized kind of the importance of Menhaden in the ecosystem. And in fact, our single species assessments used to use output from a multi-species VPA to help scale that estimate of natural mortality. So our single species assessments were using ecological considerations to develop reference points and population estimates based on some of these predator-prey interactions. And in 2006, before there was even a coastwide cap or a coastwide quota, the board implemented the Chesapeake Bay cap to restrict the amount of Menhaden taken from the Chesapeake Bay because we recognized that it was an important predator nursery ground. And so that cap was based on historical information with the intent of not allowing that fishery to expand more than it already had in this important nursery ground. So in 2017, the stock assessment came back and indicated that we had good stock status relative to our single species reference point. So we were not overfished, overfishing was not occurring, and the board had to decide what to do about the amount of harvest they were going to allow after that. And so the board decided to allow a slight increase in quota from those 2012 levels, but they were more conservative than the single species reference points would have allowed, and providing kind of an ad hoc buffer for these ecosystem services. And the goal of Amendment 3 was to use the single species reference points until the ecological reference point work group delivered more quantitative advice. So when it comes to forage fish management, historically, a lot of the advice has been on the basis of sort of qualitative buffers or of meta-analyses of multiple different stocks and multiple different species, because a lot of quantitative advice for specific fisheries, specific species, specific ecosystem interactions is difficult to come by. And we didn't have it at this point, but it was basically the focus of the ERP work group over the next 3 to 4 years to get us to where we are now. And with that, they also said with Amendment 3 that the ERPs could be adopted through board action with no need for another addendum or amendment to the FMP. We would not have to go through an extra regulatory process. Once we had these quantitative reference points, they could be adopted easily. Which brings us to the 2020 ERP assessment. So the point of this assessment, or the basic goals of the assessment, were to develop models, to estimate population parameters, and to develop methods to determine reference points and total allowable catch for Atlantic Menhaden that accounted for Atlantic Menhaden's role as a forage fish. So to accomplish that, The ERP work group looked at a whole suite of different models. We looked at ranging from very simple, like surplus production models with time varying R, that time varying rate of increase, to surplus production models that incorporated predation, to a multi-species statistical catch at age focused on a limited suite of predators, and to two ecopath with ecosim models ranging from a limited predator prey field in the mice model to a full-blown ecopath with ecosim model that incorporated multiple different species and species complexes. And so in the meantime, we were also working on the single species statistical catch at age model. The Beaufort assessment model, or the BAM, was running through this assessment in parallel so that we could have the best available information from the single species assessment in order to inform this multi-species assessment. For the different models, we focused on a subset of what we were calling like the ERP species, which were 2 prey species and 4 predator species. These obviously Atlantic menhaden, and then Atlantic herring was considered as an alternate prey source. And the predator species that we were focused on were species that had a significant amount of menhaden in their diet based on diet data, and also had good quality information on surveys and assessments to help inform the modeling that we were doing, as well as being relevant to ASMFC management processes. So the predator species included bluefish, spiny dogfish, striped bass, and weakfish. Striped bass and weakfish are exclusively managed by the Commission, and the Commission cooperatively manages bluefish and spiny dogfish with NOAA. And all of these species had a benchmark assessment or assessment update with data through 2017 available. And obviously not all of those models used all of these species. So some of the simplest models that time varying R didn't use any other predator or prey species. And some of the models like the full-blown EWE model used more predators and prey in that model than these key species. But we wanted to make sure that we had a consistent set of predators and prey that with a consistent data set to focus on some of those intermediate complexity models so that we could separate out some of the effects of the model versus some of the effects of the data. So we did all this work, we came up with all these different models, and we evaluated the models based on the comparisons of the model performance, including estimates of age 1 biomass and exploitation rate, as well as their ability to address management objectives. And that's kind of the part that I'm going to focus on here, because that actually turned out to be the most useful part of this process. The models were able to come up with very similar estimates of biomass and exploitation rate for Atlantic menhaden, which is not that surprising because we went through a lot of effort to make sure that they were using comparable data sets. So when you use the same input from these models to these models, they're all telling you roughly the same story about what's happening with age 1 biomass and what's happening with exploitation rate. The difference is in how these models are sort of parameterizing the background or the context for those trajectories. And so the ecosystem management objectives was where the models really differed in their ability to provide, has differed in their ability to provide this information. So the fundamental objectives for the ecosystem management that the board identified through a structured decision-making process where we brought stakeholders and managers and scientists to the table and prior to the assessment and said, what's important for you when you manage menhaden? What kind of objectives do you have here for this species? And so the key objectives were, we wanted to sustain menhaden to provide for directed menhaden fisheries. We wanted to sustain menhaden to provide for the predators that relied on them and the fisheries that relied on those predators. We wanted to provide stability for all of these fisheries, the directed fisheries as well as the predator fisheries. And we wanted to minimize the risk to sustainability due to the changing environment. Now, we did not rank these objectives. These are all important objectives, and obviously you can't maximize all of these over time. But it gave us a starting point in order to provide a tool that could allow managers to evaluate the trade-offs between these objectives in a quantitative and transparent way. And so when we looked at these models, with the ability to provide, with their ability to answer these objectives, to provide information to inform these objectives, then you can see that these different kinds of models are providing different levels of information. And so, we're not going to zoom in on these different categories here. I think the important part is really that, the single species model can't provide you a lot of this information on the predator side that we were interested in. And neither can some of these simpler models that were strictly focused on menhaden or strictly looking at the top-down effects of predation on menhaden. And so as a result, we found that the multi-species statistical catch-at age and the EWE models were the only models that provided information on predator biomass and predator fishing mortality. So rather than leaving that sort of blank or unexplained, or rather than taking inputs from other places, they were the only ones that could help us understand how these systems were interacting. And furthermore, only the EWE models included that bottom-up feedback to evaluate the effects of menhaden biomass and menhaden fishing mortality on the predator populations themselves, as opposed to just looking at what is the effect of predator biomass and fishing mortality on menhaden. The EWE right now lets us close that loop. The current implementation of the multi-species statistical catch-at age model doesn't include that kind of feedback loop, but that is something that we can build in as part of our next steps. So as a result of kind of these comparisons, the ERP working group recommended a combination of the single species model, the Beaufort assessment model, and an intermediate complexity EWE model as a tool for managers to evaluate the trade-offs between menhaden harvest and predator biomass. So basically, the single species model provides a lot of great detail on menhaden population dynamics that aren't fully captured in some of these ecosystem models, but the ecosystem models can provide that predator prey and ecosystem context that the single species model is missing. And so as we continue to develop these models, it would be great to have a single model that can provide you with the level of detail that the single species model can for all the species involved. But I think we're just not there yet. So using this combination approach takes the sort of the best characteristics of each model, or takes the strengths of each model and combines them into a tool that managers can use. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Nwax mice tool and what it does and how ASMFC is using it. So as I said, the recommended model is what we're calling the Nwax mice model. It stands for the Northwest Atlantic Continental Shelf Model of Intermediate Complexity for Ecosystems, or Nwax mice. And it's basically an EWE model with a limited predator prey field. So it includes all those key ecosystem species that we identified before, as well as bay anchovy, which is another important predator or important prey for these predators, as well as sort of your generic detritus, phytoplankton, et cetera, categories. But the specific ones that we go into detail with the modeling are these predator and prey species. We did compare this to the full ecosystem model to make sure that that this limited view of the ecosystem is not missing any more important predators. And in fact, the intermediate complexity EWE identified the same sort of sensitive predators as the full model. So this graph is from the full EWE model, identifying the biomass trajectories of predators and prey species that were affected by increasing menhaden fishing mortality. So on the x-axis here, this is what happens as you increase fishing mortality on menhaden over time. And the y-axis is biomass relative to the status quo, or basically where we were in 2017. And so you can see for most of these species, as you increase fishing mortality on menhaden, it doesn't really have a strong effect on the biomass relative to where we were in 2017. You see some species, as some predators, as you really start to ramp up that fishing mortality, do show a bit of a decline, and some show an increase. But the most sensitive ones were striped bass here in this kind of greenish line, and it says shorebirds here. That's actually piscivorous birds like osprey and eagles. So those two were the most sensitive, and you can see their trajectories really overlap for certainly this beginning part of the time series that we're most, or beginning part of the F series that we're most interested in. So basically, if we can do something to help sustain striped bass, then we're also going to be helping to sustain those nearshore piscivorous birds, as opposed to, for example, if we had focused on a different species in here like bluefish that is not as sensitive to menhaden, then increasing that fishing pressure on bluefish won't have as big an effect on bluefish as it would on shorebirds, which aren't in the model, and therefore could potentially cause a disconnect. But we can see that we are getting kind of that similar most sensitive predators in the intermediate complexity model, which gave us more confidence in this model going forward. So the Nwax mice model is a tool. And this is something I think we wanted to emphasize to the board and specifically in our TORs as well, which is that there is no one right answer for an ecological reference point. The target and threshold levels of fishing mortality for Atlantic menhaden depend on the management objectives for the ecosystem. That is, where do you want your predator populations to be, and what do you want your predator fisheries to look like? There are trade-offs between what you do for menhaden and what you get out of the predator fisheries. And so this tool will allow you to examine those trade-offs and have a conversation about the levels of harvest and the levels of risk for both your prey species, for both menhaden and your predator species. And so that's really the benefit of this tool. It's not here to give you one right answer, it's to help you get to the right answer based on your objectives. So here's an example trade-off evaluation. We're calling these the rainbow plots because they're very brightly colored. And so basically what you can see is we're plotting different levels of menhaden F on the x-axis and different levels of striped bass F on the y-axis. And so obviously what happens to striped bass is going to be a function not just of menhaden, but also of the F that it's experiencing in its own fisheries. And so this is why we're doing this on kind of this XY plot, is to look at different combinations of fishing mortality for both of these species. And then the color on the back of the graph represents where striped bass will end up in the long term relative to their biomass target. So if you can fish menhaden at a specific level and you fish striped bass at a specific level, where is that population going to stabilize? And so in this graph, the warm colors, the reds, indicate the being below the striped bass target, and the warmer, the redder that color is, the further below you are that target. Versus, so that obviously is occurring up in this corner where you have both high striped bass fishing mortality and high menhaden fishing mortality. That combination is going to push the population down. Compared to over this corner where you have low fishing mortality on both species, then you're ending up in these cooler colors where you are above the target for striped bass. And so these black lines are basically combinations of striped bass fishing mortality and menhaden fishing mortality that will keep the striped bass population either at their biomass threshold or at their biomass target. And so this is basically an example of a trade-off. That is, if you want to increase fishing mortality on menhaden, you have to decrease fishing mortality on striped bass in order to keep them at the same place. So if you don't, so here's the striped bass fishing mortality level in 2017, this dashed line. And what you can see is, first of all, striped bass were experiencing overfishing in 2017. And if you track this line across the graph, there's basically no level of fishing mortality on Menhaden that will bring you back to your striped bass biomass target if you continue to overfish striped bass. So there's these species are related, but they don't exist in a vacuum. However, if we lower striped bass fishing mortality to the F target, then you can see fishing Menhaden at different levels will give you different outcomes. And so if you fish Menhaden at very low levels or don't fish them at all, then you're going to be above that biomass target. As you start to increase fishing mortality on Menhaden, then you're going to push the biomass of striped bass down, even if you're fishing them at their F target. And you could end up pushing them sort of below their F target and even below their biomass threshold, depending on how aggressively you're fishing Menhaden. So if we kind of look at where they intersect, this vertical dashed line is where Menhaden fishing mortality was in 2017. And so you can see that if you fish striped bass at their F target, and fish Menhaden at their current 2017 level of fishing mortality, then you'll end up just above the biomass target for striped bass. Whereas if you fish Menhaden at their single species F target, which is this new dotted line, so that's higher than where we were in 2017, then even if you fish striped bass at their biomass target, they're going to end up between their biomass target and their biomass threshold. And if we fish Menhaden at their single species F threshold, then striped bass will end up below their biomass threshold in the long term. So this is an example kind of trade-off where you can look at different combinations of fishing mortality for striped bass and for Menhaden and figure out where your predator population is going to end up. In this case, we're looking at sort of existing reference points for these species. But of course, you can look at a whole range. You can look at basically this entire continuous plot back here to decide, what do you want your predator fishery to look like? What do you want your prey fishery to look like? What do you want your predator biomass to look like in the end? And what combination gets you closest to sort of maximizing all of your objectives here? So this graph was really focused on striped bass because, again, we found that striped bass were the most sensitive predator to the Menhaden harvest. So smaller increases in Menhaden F caused more of a decline for striped bass than they did for those other predator species. So if we focus on kind of that trade-off plot for striped bass and develop ERPs that can sustain striped bass, they should also be sustaining those less sensitive predators, as well as the predators that showed a similar response in the full EWE model, but weren't necessarily included in the Nwax mice model. So the board looked at a bunch of this different stuff, and in the end decided on an ERP target that we defined as the maximum F on Menhaden that sustains striped bass at their biomass target when striped bass are fished at their F target. And the ERP threshold was defined as the maximum F on Menhaden that keeps striped bass at their biomass threshold when striped bass are fished at their F target. So if we kind of take a cross section of that rainbow plot, this is what we end up with. And so this solid line here is what happens to striped bass biomass when you fish it at the target as a function of Menhaden F increasing. And so this gray line here is basically where we were in 2017. That's the F that the Menhaden population was experiencing in 2017. The solid greenish line is the ERP target. And so you can see those were very close. We were almost at the ERP target at that point. And so again, here's the single species target. And then here's the ERP target compared to ERP threshold in the dotted line compared to the single species threshold in the bluer dotted line. And so you can see those ERP targets and thresholds are lower than the single species targets and thresholds, which says that you have to forego some yield on Menhaden in order to maintain striped bass at their target the way that you want to. So here's basically that graph in a table form where you can see kind of the value of the ERP compared to the single species reference points for the target and the threshold and where we were in 2017. So again, the Nwax mice tool here is what we're using to evaluate these trade-offs and set these reference points. However, those ecosystem models aren't great at capturing a lot of the interannual variability from recruitment dynamics. They're not great at capturing some of the fleet dynamics that we have in these populations, especially in like these short-term population scenarios where we want to figure out how many Menhaden are out there today and how many can we take next year. And so that's where the single species model comes in. We use the Nwax mice tool to set these reference points in looking at this long term in the equilibrium. Where do these things end up? Where does this variability balance out? The single species model is what we're using to evaluate status relative to F reference points and fecundity reference points, and to set a TAC or a quota that will allow us to achieve that F target. So the board adopted these ERPs in August of 2020. These are now the reference points that we use to evaluate stock status. Relative to the ERP target and the ERP threshold for both fecundity and for fishing mortality, the Menhaden stock was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring. So these are the graphs you can see of fecundity over time relative to the fecundity that you expect if you fish at these ERP targets and thresholds, as well as the fishing mortality compared to those ERP targets and thresholds. And so you can see the stock was overfished for a period in the late 1970s, in the 1970s up to the late 1980s, early 1990s, but has since recovered. And it was experiencing overfishing as well as being above the F target, the ERP F target, for a long period of time. But with that decline in landings has kind of come down, and we're hovering around the ERP target now. So in addition to evaluating stock status with these reference points, we also use them to set the TAC. So the Menhaden TC conducted projections using the single species model to evaluate the probability of exceeding the F target and the F threshold under different quota conditions. So for example, if you compare the 216,000 metric ton TAC, which was actually, sorry, it's not the current TAC anymore. That was the TAC when we did these projections in 2020. And that gave you a 66% chance of exceeding the ERP F target in 2021, and a 60% chance of exceeding the ERP target in 2022. There was no chance of exceeding the ERP threshold. However, the board really wants to focus the management here around the F targets. And so as a result, the board ended up choosing the 194,000 metric ton, or about a 10% decrease, in order to have close to a 50% chance of achieving the F target in 2022, and a 0% chance of exceeding the F threshold. So no chance of overfishing relative to these ERPs in either year. So this is great, and this is really exciting, and this represents sort of the first steps towards ecosystem-based fishery management. This is really the first fishery on the Atlantic coast to be managed with reference points from a quantitative ecosystem model. The Atlantic herring control rule, which just went into place in January of this year, provides sort of, I think, a similar step towards this ecosystem approach. We still got there first, but also it's a slightly different approach in that they focus their harvest control rule on leaving a buffer to account for herring's role as a forage fish, rather than using an ecosystem model directly for management. But they're both sort of providing the same ecosystem approach to fishery management. That is, we're managing individual species in an ecosystem context. So the reference points that we set for Menhaden are based on the striped bass reference points, and they're designed to account for Menhaden's role as a forage fish. But we haven't taken the next steps to really link the full ecosystem together. So we're not managing the ecosystem as a whole, we're managing individual species in an ecosystem context. And so that's kind of the distinction people make between ecosystem-based fishery management, where you're managing the ecosystem as a whole, and this ecosystem approach to fishery management, where you're managing these individual species in the ecosystem context. But this still represents a huge step forward in terms of accounting for forage fish's role in a quantitative sense. So great. I think, we've definitely patted ourselves on the back for that. And I think it's a great step forward, but it's only the first step. There is still a ton more stuff to do. So next steps for the assessment. One of the things that we found when we were working with the Nwax mice model is that the ERPs were sensitive to the level of Atlantic herring biomass in your final equilibrium scenario. So these reference points are based on keeping everything else in the ecosystem kind of at 2017 or status quo levels, and varying F on striped bass and varying F on Menhaden. If you go and use that model, the base model, to look at scenarios where we keep everything at their F target, or where Atlantic herring are at their biomass threshold and everything else in the model is at status quo, then you get slightly different curves and you end up in slightly different places relative to this relative to where striped bass is going to be. So kind of if you see this intersection of these lines with the biomass target for striped bass as your, as that's where you want your ERP target to be, you can see there's some variability about where those lines intersect depending on what you're assuming about the biomass of other species in the ecosystem and the biomass of Atlantic herring. However, this is likely due to the fact that this model does not have any spatial or seasonal dynamics. And so basically the model is, the model just treats this as one big population. And so Atlantic herring are a very important part of the striped bass diet, but really only for in certain areas and in certain times of years. Whereas Menhaden make up a different proportion of that diet in different areas and different times of years. And so if you include some seasonality to that diet composition data, then that sensitivity really goes away. This seasonality plot is really just sort of our first step at taking a stab at this, but this is kind of what led us to kind of the next big thing we need to address with this model, which is dealing with some of those seasonal and spatial dynamics in order to get a more stable model going forward. And so you can see that kind of that interaction between striped bass and herring is really influenced by what you assume about how much their diets are overlapping in time and in space. And similarly, these are, I highlighted on this chart just a few of the areas that, got this little asterisk, which means we need to work on it more. And those two big objectives that these models can't quite address yet are the prey availability relative to predator distributions. So I think one of the big questions that the board is interested in, and we're interested in as scientists, is does the Chesapeake Bay need a different ERP than the Gulf of Maine? And this is part of the challenge of dealing with these migratory species that are moving up and down the coast and interacting with different ecosystems and different food webs as they go. So as we said, there's a Chesapeake Bay cap because we know the Chesapeake Bay is an important nursery ground for a lot of these species that are included in the model. But those species leave the bay and they move out and they interact with ecosystems in the Gulf of Maine. They interact with the mid-Atlantic bight and the pelagic ecosystems out there. And so we want more information on how those food webs are different and how they interact as a whole. So right now we're sort of managing this ecosystem as a giant blob, and those reference points are working for the giant blob. But do we need differences and more fine scale modeling to get at differences in the ecosystems in these different regions? And obviously, I think the answer is yes, but the extent to which those reference points are going to be different is something we really need to dig into. And similarly, the big elephant in the room for all of our species is how will climate change impact these ecosystems? These models right now aren't including anything about changing climate conditions in the future, and partly because we really don't know how these ecosystems are going to be impacted by climate change. Will we need different ecosystem reference points under different climate scenarios? And I think these are questions that are kind of medium term and long term. So that seasonal dynamic thing is something that we plan to address for the next benchmark assessment, which is going to be in 2025. But spatial stuff, we need to dig into the data and figure out if we have enough data to support a more spatially explicit model, and what level of spatial dynamics can we include. And that's something we want to focus on for the benchmark after the next one. But I think climate change is something that is going to be the real challenge for a lot of these reference points, and for management in general. And so I think, for sure it's something we'd like to look at, but it's going to rely on having good data on how climate change is going to affect these species individually so that we can model how they're going to affect the ecosystem. So that's really kind of a long-term 2020, 2031 and beyond. And of course, like I said, this is still an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. How do we transition from a single species management to a full EBFM is, I think, something that's really still up in the air for us and for all of our management partners. We may reconsider the biological reference points in the next amendment, or we may not, or in the amendment next to that, after that. Should there be some kind of joint striped bass Menhaden board or a subcommittee of our larger policy board to consider how you set reference points for these two species together? Like I said, there's a trade-off, but we've kind of only been pushing that lever in one direction, and the level of striped bass that you accept has been fixed. Should it be fixed, or should there be a conversation? Should we be able to evaluate the trade-offs with both of these together? Is a big question for ecosystem management that we haven't figured out, and I think a lot of people have not figured out, as well as how do you go from this single species individual context to a full ecosystem context? And then how do we get these multiple different agencies involved? We manage a couple of these species cooperatively. So, but in a lot of cases, NOAA has the final say on these regulations, and we work with them to get it into our management process. But if you're managing the ecosystem, you're going to be managing species that are managed at the state level, at the commission level, and at the federal level. And getting everybody at the same page in terms of evaluating these trade-offs, I think, is going to be a challenge from a management and structural standpoint. I think it's a worthwhile challenge, but this is really, this is, like I said, this is the first step that we've taken, and it's a great step and it's an important step, but it's a long road that maybe we want to go down all the way and maybe we don't. But there's a lot of work still to do, and that's why it's exciting and interesting. And so, yeah, overall, more work needs to be done on the science and on the management framework to get to full ecosystem-based fishery management. But I think the process of getting there still gives you something worthwhile. So here's some more places you can get more information, and I'm happy to stop and take questions now.